Hey guys, tonight we begin with the bizarre sleep habits of the Vikings, the Norse seafarers known for raiding monasteries and apparently having very specific ideas about bedtime. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with one of the strangest sleep quirks the Vikings shared with much of medieval Europe: segmented sleep. That's right. The Vikings didn't sleep in one long continuous stretch like most of us do today. Instead, they practiced what historians call first sleep and second sleep. Imagine sleeping for 4 hours, waking up in the middle of the night, doing a few chores or contemplating your enemies, and then going back to sleep for another 4 hours. That was normal. You didn't have insomnia. You were just culturally appropriate. The first sleep typically started not long after sundown. Vikings would wind down the evening by sharing stories, eating a final meal, and probably arguing over whose turn it was to guard the goats. Then they'd settle in for a few hours of rest. But around midnight, right when modern people would consider the night ruined by waking up, they'd rise again. What did they do with that time? A lot, actually. Some would tend to the fire or check on livestock. Others would pray, meditate, or sharpen weapons, which really tells you all you need to know about Viking priorities. According to some sagas, this was also considered an ideal time for intimacy, romantic or otherwise, and while the firelight flickered and the wind howled outside, they'd occupy themselves quietly before easing back into second sleep. Segmented sleep wasn't some random Viking oddity. It was widespread across pre-industrial societies, a natural rhythm influenced by the rising and setting of the sun, not digital clocks and caffeine. In the age before artificial lighting, people's internal clocks leaned into these two-part nights like it was the original factory setting. But let's be honest, it's easy to romanticize this from a distance. In reality, waking up in a dark longhouse next to 4 other people, 2 chickens and an axe probably wasn't the serene introspective break you think it was. And let's not forget it was cold, extremely cold. Getting out of bed at midnight in 9th century Norway was less about circadian rhythm and more about survival anxiety. So you've woken up at midnight in a smoky Viking longhouse. It's pitch black, except for the dying embers of the fire. Your feet are freezing. Your cousin is snoring like a bear choking on a log, and you've got a good hour or 2 before second sleep kicks in. Now what? Welcome to the midnight interval, that strange waking period between first and second sleep that Vikings filled with an odd mix of chores, rituals, and whatever else they could do quietly enough not to wake the goat. First up, eating. With little refrigeration and 0 midnight DoorDash, Vikings often kept dried meats, smoked fish, or leftover stew within reach. Midnight snacks weren't indulgent. They were practical. If you'd spent the evening rowing, farming, or dragging half a deer back through the snow, waking up hungry wasn't unusual. So they'd stoke the fire, heat a bowl of something, and gnaw in the dark like civilized cave people. But food wasn't the only thing on the midnight menu. This quiet time was often used for reflection. Without light pollution, noise, or smartphones, you could sit by the fire and think about life or death, or whether Odin was disappointed in your sword technique. Midnight became a time for private thoughts, prayers, or whispered conversations. Some believed dreams from the first sleep were clearer, like messages from the spirit world. Others may have spent the time worrying about everything they needed to do the next day, which frankly makes Vikings more relatable than we'd like to admit. And then, of course, there's intimacy. Yes, archaeological evidence and medieval writing suggest many couples chose the middle of the night as a prime time for romance. It makes sense. You'd had a few hours to rest. You weren't exhausted yet. And let's be honest, the fire was already going. There's even a suggestion that some people timed their entire procreative schedules around this interval. That's right. Vikings invented the midnight booty call. If there's one thing the Vikings knew, it's that the world didn't pause while you slept. Villages got raided, livestock got stolen, and enemies had an annoying habit of showing up just before dawn. So when it came to sleep, especially in wartime or while travelling, the Vikings didn't just sprawl out and hope for the best. They organised sleep shifts. Yes, even bedtime had a battle strategy. Especially on long ships or in military camps, someone was always awake. It might have been the shipmaster, a trusted warrior, or the guy who lost at dice. But someone had to stay alert, scanning the horizon for enemy sails or making sure the boat didn't drift into a fjord. And if you think modern people complain about night shifts, imagine keeping watch in freezing rain with nothing but your beard for insulation. These shifts usually ran in cycles. One group slept while another kept watch. Then they'd switch. The result? No one was ever fully rested, but no one got murdered in their sleep either. It was a compromise Viking style. Even back home, some form of night watch was common. In longhouses, those big communal halls where everyone slept together. Someone might stay up tending the fire, listening for wolves, or just poking around to make sure the animals weren't chewing on someone's boots again. And in larger settlements, guards patrolled perimeters or manned lookout towers. But this wasn't just about safety, it was about culture. Being always ready was a point of pride. A Viking man wasn't supposed to sleep like the dead. He was supposed to sleep like a warrior, lightly, suspiciously, and with one hand on an axe. Deep sleep was for people who didn't expect to be attacked by surprise. And while it sounds exhausting, and probably was, this vigilance was part of their identity. To be Viking was to be tough. You slept when you could. You stayed alert when you had to. And if you dozed off during your watch, well, let's just say someone might urinate in your helmet as a lesson. Picture this. It's midnight in a Viking longhouse. There's frost on the windows, a smoky fire in the centre, and half a dozen Norsemen curled up under rough woolen blankets. Now look closer. None of them are undressed for sleep. There are no wardrobe changes, no rituals of winding down with cosy robes, because Vikings slept fully clothed, often in the same garments they wore all day. And in some cases they even added a little something extra, like armour. Let's start with the basics. Viking clothing was all about layering. Wool tunics, linen undershirts, thick cloaks, and fur when available. These weren't just outfits, they were survival tools. If you stripped down for bed, you were basically asking to wake up with hypothermia. This was Scandinavia after all, not a cosy Roman villa with floor heating. And while sleeping in your clothes isn't exactly strange by modern standards, the Vikings took it a step further. If you were a warrior, especially while travelling or during times of conflict, you might sleep with a bit of your gear on. Not full chain mail unless you were extremely hardcore or just had a terrible sense of comfort, but enough to be ready. Because, let's face it, the odds of waking up to a raid were non-zero. And fumbling with your pants while someone's breaking down your door with a spear is a quick way to end up in Valhalla. There are sagas that describe warriors dozing with their helmets nearby, weapons at the ready, and cloaks still clasped. It wasn't about style. It was about not dying. Comfort was negotiable. Readiness wasn't. And this wasn't limited to warriors. Even regular folks might sleep in their outer garments during winter months. The idea of putting on warm clothes after waking up simply didn't apply when warmth needed to be trapped and preserved through the night. Taking your shirt off was basically admitting you'd given up. If there's one rule that Viking culture seemed to follow religiously, it was this: never be more than an arm's length from a blade. Even when sleeping, especially when sleeping. For Vikings, the bed wasn't just a place to rest, it was a potential battlefield. The idea of tucking yourself in without a weapon nearby would have sounded as absurd to them as forgetting to bring your sword to a duel. So whether they were in a longhouse, on a boat, or camping under the stars, weapons were treated like bedtime companions, cold, pointy, and comforting. Sagas and archaeological evidence suggest that many Viking men and some women literally slept with their weapons. This didn't necessarily mean cuddling a sword like a teddy bear, though to be fair, some of them probably did. More often, weapons were placed under furs, beside bedrolls, or even held in hand. Think of it as security through sharp steel, and this wasn't about bravado, it was practical. Viking homes were often remote, vulnerable, and made of flammable wood. Bandits, rival clans, and wild animals didn't wait for daylight to strike. Being unarmed when startled awake was a quick way to become an epic poem no one remembered the end of. There's even a word for this mindset in Old Norse culture: vigilance. To sleep too deeply was to sleep carelessly. The truly honourable warrior stayed alert even in dreams. If you slept through a break-in or worse, died in your sleep unarmed, good luck getting into Valhalla. Odin was picky, and the weapons themselves, they weren't stashed away in chests or racks. Axes leaned against walls, swords lay beside pillows, spears might be wedged under the bed frame if you were fancy enough to have one. A well-rested Viking was one who could go from snoring to swinging in under 5 seconds. Of course, this came with risks. The occasional midnight foot impalement, a few accidental elbow slices, but to a Viking that was better than waking up defenceless. Let's get one thing out of the way. The average Viking didn't fall asleep in some romantic fur-draped 4-poster bed carved from ancient oak. That's Hollywood. The real story is that unless you were wealthy, noble, or at least high-ranking, your bed was likely a glorified sack of hay, possibly shared. Definitely itchy. For the elite, yes, proper beds existed. Archaeological digs have found bed frames in high-status graves, complete with ornate carvings and decorative hardware. These were the wooden box beds, often seen in museums and fantasy shows, partially enclosed for warmth, sometimes even with curtains to hold in heat and hold out snoring servants. But for most Vikings, not quite. Common folk slept on the floor, on benches, or on large wooden platforms near the hearth. Softness was relative. A pile of straw, moss, or wool-stuffed sacks if you were lucky, and some old boat sails or sheepskins if you weren't. Comfort was not the priority. Warmth and survival were. And don't picture a bedroom. The longhouse was one giant shared space. Kitchen, bedroom, stable, and panic room all in one. At best, beds were built into the walls, wooden ledges where you could lie down, roll up in a fur, and try to ignore your cousin's breath. The closer to the central fire, the better. The elders and sick were often placed near it. Children and animals might be packed in around them, creating a sort of human-to-livestock heat sandwich. Romantic. No. Efficient. Very. Cleanliness was another issue. You didn't flip your mattress every 6 months. You shook out the straw when it started to smell like goat pee and hoped your fleas stayed on their half of the bed. And still, this was better than sleeping outdoors or on a ship deck with the wind howling down your tunic. Vikings weren't chasing RM cycles. They were chasing enough warmth to survive the night without waking up with frost on their eyebrows. If you were a Viking of modest means, meaning you didn't own land, livestock, or a suspiciously shiny axe, then odds are you spent a good chunk of your life sleeping on dirt. Not metaphorically, literally. No mattress, no frame, just you, some animal skins, and a nice patch of packed earth that hopefully wasn't damp or covered in goat droppings. Inside longhouses, the floor was usually made of compacted dirt, sometimes sprinkled with straw to soften things up, or more realistically, to soak up whatever spilled from animals, soup bowls, or both. Sleeping directly on the floor wasn't a sign of failure. It was normal, functional, low-maintenance Viking minimalism at its finest. And for the truly poor, this might have been their only option. No benches, no wooden slats, just fur pelts laid down in a spot with good fire access and minimal hoof traffic. There are even accounts of travellers and guests sleeping near the doorway, which in Viking terms was one rung above outside on the hospitality ladder. Sleeping by the door meant you were welcome, just not that welcome. Also, you would probably be the first person to get stabbed if someone broke in, so that would be fun. The advantage of sleeping on dirt was heat. Earth retains warmth surprisingly well, especially if you're pressed between 2 other humans and a dog. And when your biggest enemy is freezing to death, you take what you can get. In the summer, it stayed cool, though comfortable is probably a strong word. Survivable might be more accurate. Of course, this style of sleep didn't come with back support. There were no chiropractors in the Viking Age. If you hurt your spine, you walked it off or became a bard. Still, for all its discomfort, this wasn't seen as shameful or sad. In Viking culture, toughness was admired, and luxury was sometimes viewed with suspicion. If you could sleep on the ground and wake up ready to raid a monastery, you were doing just fine. If you value silence, personal space, and separate bedrooms, you may want to skip time travelling to the Viking Age. Because for most Norse folk, sleeping was a communal sport. Entire families, and sometimes extended families, house servants, visitors, and the occasional animal, all slept in the same room, and often in the same bed platform, not for fun but for warmth. Remember, this was medieval Scandinavia. Winters were long, cold and unforgiving, and fireplaces weren't exactly cranking out modern insulation. So unless you were nobility with your own private box bed, and even then it wasn't that private, you shared whatever sleeping space was available. The closer to the fire, the better. The closer to Grandma's snoring mouth, the less ideal. Longhouses were the Viking version of open-plan living. No interior walls, no cosy nooks, just a central hearth with people arranged like tired sardines on either side. Beds, if you had one, were built into the walls or arranged along benches. Otherwise, you picked a spot on the floor and made it work. If someone rolled into your space during the night, congratulations, you are now friends. Sleeping arrangements weren't just about comfort, they reflected status. The heads of the household usually got the warmest, most central positions. Children were packed in wherever they'd fit. Servants and distant cousins got the outer edges, possibly next to the door, the dog or the family goat. If you woke up with a hoof in your face, well, try not to take it personally. And let's not forget, all of this was happening with zero ventilation. A packed room full of humans, animals, smoke, stew, and the faint musk of wool and wet boots. You didn't sleep through the night. You survived it. Privacy. That was a Roman problem. Vikings didn't need it. In fact, some scholars suggest that this close proximity sleeping encouraged strong social bonds, the kind forged through firelight, shared stories, and the mutual trauma of hearing your uncle mumble Viking poetry in his sleep. If you thought sharing a sleeping platform with your in-laws was rough, imagine throwing a goat into the mix, or a cow, or 3 chickens who absolutely refuse to shut up. Welcome to the Viking version of central heating, sleeping with your livestock. No, this wasn't some quirky rural tradition. This was survival. Viking longhouses were multi-purpose structures, one big room for eating, sleeping, working, storytelling, and yes, sheltering animals. In fact, many longhouses were split into 2 main areas, one for humans, one for livestock. Sometimes there was a raised threshold between them. Sometimes there was a wooden partition, and sometimes you just accepted that the family sheep was now your bedtime neighbour. Why? Because animals gave off heat, and in Scandinavian winters every bit counted. A cow could warm up a small corner of a house just by existing. Several cows, that was practically radiant floor heating. Chickens, less effective, more chaotic, but still helpful. And the animals weren't exactly free roaming through the house. They had stalls or pens, at least in well-built homes, but sounds, smells, and the occasional escape attempt were part of the nightly soundtrack. A gentle lullaby of hoof-scraping, snorting, clucking, and maybe the sound of a pig loudly judging your dreams. Cleanliness, as you can guess, was not optimal. Floors were packed earth, straw was everywhere, and the line between kitchen and barn was more of a vague suggestion. But for Viking families, the trade-off was worth it. Stay warm and alive, or stay clean and dead. Easy choice. Sleeping with animals wasn't considered strange. It was a sign that you were doing things right. You were maximising resources, protecting your animals from theft or cold, and ensuring your children didn't turn into Viking cycles overnight. And of course, kids loved it. Free heat and a living pillow. What more could you want? Let's say you were a Viking on the move, heading out for a quick raid, a long trade expedition, or maybe a casual colonization attempt. That meant one thing: you were sleeping on a boat. And Viking ships weren't exactly luxury liners. Viking longships were sleek, open-ended decked vessels powered by sails and rowers designed for speed and terrifying surprise appearances on foreign shores. But comfort is not in the budget. There were no cabins, no hammocks, and no cosy little berths. Just planks, cold, wet planks, and maybe a pile of sails if someone let you borrow one. Sleep aboard ship was entirely dictated by weather, waves, and watch duty. There was no schedule, just exhaustion. Row for hours, sleep when you can. Sometimes you'd collapse in your own sweat and sea spray. Other times you'd try to catch a nap while lying next to barrels of dried fish and a guy with a leaky helmet. If it rained, you got wet. If the wind picked up, you braced yourself and tried not to slide into someone's sword. And if you were lucky enough to sleep beneath the sail, congratulations. You just earned the VIP section. Crew members often rotated shifts. Some would steer, some would row, and some would try to get a few moments of rest in the midst of groaning wood and crashing waves. It wasn't restful. It wasn't quiet. It was barely sleep. More like extended blinking. And then there were the smells. Salt water, unwashed bodies, dried meat, and sheep. If you brought livestock along, imagine trying to drift off while someone sharpens a blade behind you, and a goat stands over your face. That's not a nightmare. That's Tuesday on a Viking ship. But the Vikings weren't looking for comfort. They were looking for conquest. Sleeping on a ship wasn't about rest. It was about survival between storms. You didn't need to feel refreshed. You just needed to be able to swing an axe when you reached land. For the Vikings, dreams weren't just a side effect of sleep. They were messages, whispers from the gods, warnings from the dead, and occasionally psychic spoilers for how your week was about to go. Viking sagas and Eddic poetry are full of dream omens. A ship sailing west in a dream. You're going to die soon. Dream of a cold wind blowing through your house. Also, death. Wolves running through the village in your sleep. Definitely death. Basically, if you woke up and remembered anything, it probably meant you should update your will and maybe not go on that raid tomorrow. But it wasn't all doom and gloom. Some dreams were seen as visions from Odin or Freya, offering insight into battles, harvests, or hidden treasure. A good dream could elevate your status. A bad one, well, if you were smart, you kept it to yourself. No one wanted to be that guy on the boat who announced he saw everyone drowning in his sleep. Very poor morale. The Vikings even had dream interpreters, people who were considered spiritually attuned and could decipher what your nighttime visions meant. They weren't therapists. They didn't care if you were stressed about goat taxes. They wanted symbols, ravens, fire, ice, broken swords, and three-headed oxen. The weirder the better. And dreaming about the gods, that was serious business. Dreaming of Odin in particular could mean anything from divine favour to imminent slaughter. If he appeared in your dream offering advice, that was great. If he appeared silent, wearing a cloak and walking away, start digging your grave. He was known for being mysterious even in REM sleep. There was also a belief in dream walking, the idea that your spirit could leave your body during sleep and travel elsewhere. This meant a lot of people took sleep very seriously. You weren't just snoring, you were possibly off fighting spiritual battles in other realms while your body drooled on a sheepskin. In the end, sleep was never just about rest. It was a portal, a vulnerability, and occasionally a divine appointment. For Vikings, dreams weren't for dreaming. They were for surviving. Most people prepare for sleep by brushing their teeth, changing clothes, and maybe reading a book. Vikings sometimes prepared for sleep by putting on armour, just in case it was their last nap before meeting Odin. This wasn't paranoia. It was ritual preparation for battle. On the night before a fight, a raid, or any journey that might end in bloodshed, a Viking warrior might lie down in full gear, with chainmail and helmet beside the bed, and sword at the ready. Not because it was comfortable, it definitely wasn't, but because they believed the gods respected readiness. To die well and to die ready increased your chances of being chosen by the Valkyries, sleeping unarmed. That was like showing up to Valhalla in your underpants. Some warriors believed that how you slept the night before battle could determine where your soul ended up. If you were prepared, alert, and mentally already in fight mode, Odin would notice. If you were cozy, drooling on your tunic and forgot your axe in the other room, well, you might just wake up in hell. The icy afterlife reserved for people who died unheroically. A terrible fate for someone who owned 12 axes and bragged about it. The practice wasn't universal, of course. Not everyone had armour. It was expensive. But even simpler folk sometimes slept in their travel gear, or with their weapons in hand the night before a dangerous trip. It was a symbolic statement to the gods and to your crew. I'm ready, let's go. And it wasn't just about death. Sleeping this way also had tactical advantages. If you were ambushed, you didn't have time for a costume change. A fully geared warrior could leap up and fight within seconds. Imagine being the enemy who sneaks into a Viking camp, only to find your target already half awake and fully armed. When winter hit Scandinavia, it didn't arrive. It conquered. Snow fell like punishment. The sun went into hiding and the temperature dipped to, "Why is my beard frozen to my chest?" During these dark months, Viking activity slowed and sleep increased. Yes, the Vikings may have been early practitioners of a kind of human hibernation. Not the biological kind that bears do, but a seasonal rhythm of extended rest and reduced activity. In short, they slept a lot more in winter, and who could blame them? With limited daylight, icy travel conditions and little farming to do, there wasn't much incentive to leap out of bed at sunrise, especially when the sunrise wasn't until 10:30 a.m. Winter became a time of conservation. Conserve energy, conserve food, and try not to freeze solid by February. Sleeping longer during winter wasn't just a comfort, it was strategic. Less movement meant less food burned, and food supplies were precious. Why burn calories chopping wood when you could just add more layers and sleep through the next blizzard? Many families stayed indoors for days at a time, crowded around the hearth, sharing stories, meals and heat. It wasn't laziness, it was adaptation. Extended rest also allowed bodies to recover from months of labour, hunting and war. Think of it as ancient off-season training. If that training involved a lot of snoring and reindeer fur, sagas and folktales from the far north, even hint at dream seasons, periods when people felt slow, reflective, and even spiritually distant from daily life. It's possible that the Norse viewed winter not just as downtime, but as a mystical season where sleep, dreams, and introspection blurred together. And while some people still needed to stay active, guarding animals, fetching firewood and preparing food, there was definitely a shift. Winter was not the time to launch a raid. It was the time to sleep, plan a raid, and recover from the last one. While most Viking sleep habits were about staying warm, alive, and slightly less stabbed, there were moments when Vikings chose not to sleep at all, and not because of insomnia or goats being weird. Sometimes staying awake all night was intentional, even sacred. Enter ritual wakefulness. Certain Viking traditions and ceremonies involve deliberate sleep deprivation, usually to honour the dead, communicate with the gods, or prepare for something very big and very bloody. For example, during funerals, it was common for mourners to stay awake through the night in vigil, drinking, reciting poetry, and sharing stories of the deceased. Think of it as a cross between a wake and a Norse TED Talk, but with more ale and occasional axe juggling. These overnight gatherings weren't optional. Staying awake showed respect. Falling asleep, that was bad form, like texting during a eulogy, but with a higher risk of being elbowed awake by a drunk cousin. Vigil also had a spiritual edge. The Norse believed that the veil between worlds was thinner at night, especially when someone had just died. Staying awake meant you could feel the presence of the departed, maybe even catch a vision or two. Whether this was a divine connection or too much fermented honey, we may never know. Warriors too practiced ritual wakefulness before a raid or major battle. A night without sleep could serve as a form of mental sharpening, a time to meditate, focus, Or psych yourself up by staring into the fire and thinking about how awesome Valhalla sounds. Some warriors even claim to receive omens or dreams while still awake, sitting trance-like before combat. And then there were seers and velvers who sometimes stayed awake all night to perform rituals, chant spells, or interpret dreams others had. They were expected to remain alert and disturbingly calm, while everyone else was nodding off into their bowls of porridge. After all the sagas, ship raids and stew-fueled storytelling, one truth about Viking sleep becomes clear. It wasn't about luxury, it was about survival. If modern people treat sleep like a wellness activity, the Vikings treated it like one more arena to stay alive in. Everything about their rest was hard-earned. They slept in shifts so nobody got ambushed. They curled up beside fire pits, animals, and relatives, because insulation was more valuable than privacy. They wore their clothes and sometimes their armour to bed because you never knew who or what was coming through the door next. They saw dreams not as random brain static but as potential prophecies. They accepted that sometimes sleep was meant to restore the body and sometimes it was meant to prepare the soul for death. Even their rituals of wakefulness, staying up all night during funerals or battle vigils, reinforced the idea that sleep was not guaranteed and not something to be taken lightly. For the Norse, every moment of rest had a purpose. Sometimes that purpose was warmth, sometimes it was readiness, and sometimes it was to prove you were still stronger than the night itself. Comfort. That was for after the raid, after the snow melted, after you made it home with both legs. Maybe. Then you'd get a bed, probably still shared, possibly next to a goat. But despite all that, Viking sleep wasn't bleak. It was resilient. They adapted to their brutal environment with raw practicality and a touch of mysticism. They didn't invent bedtime stories, but they sure knew how to turn dreams into legends. And maybe that's the most Viking thing of all. They didn't romanticize sleep. They didn't overthink it. They just did what had to be done. Wrapped in wool, holding an axe, snoring beneath a sagging roof while the wind howled and the world waited for spring. In the year 1480, Rome was a city of incense and blood. Behind the crumbling columns of imperial glory, a new dynasty was rising. Not one of emperors, but of popes who wielded power like warlords. And into this world, on April 18th, Lucrezia Borgia was born. Her father, Rodrigo Borgia, a Spanish cardinal with ambition sharp enough to draw blood. Her mother, Venata de Catane, a Roman courtesan with connections and cunning. From the very beginning, Lucrezia's life was wrapped in silk and scandal. She wasn't just any illegitimate daughter. She was the illegitimate daughter of a man who would soon become Pope Alexander VI, arguably one of the most controversial pontiffs in history. The word nepotism didn't just apply to the Borgias, they practically copyrighted it. Rodrigo Borgia didn't bother hiding his children. On the contrary, he flaunted them, installing them in courts and marriages like chess pieces, pawns in a game where the Pope held all the power. Lucretia grew up in the Vatican shadow, educated and fluent in Latin, Greek and poetry. Her childhood wasn't filled with toys, but with tutors, political rumours and secret ceremonies. She wasn't meant for innocence. She was being raised to seduce alliances. By the age of 11, the rumours had already started. Whispers that she was more than just a girl, that she was a weapon, a vessel of beauty and manipulation, trained to be married off to the highest bidder or most strategic family. Her father saw her not as a child, but as a key, a way to unlock influence across Italy's fragmented city-states. But here's where things get complicated. Was Lucitia a scheming enchantress from the beginning? Or was she a girl being groomed by a corrupt family given no other path than the one laid out by her infamous surname? As Lucitia reached her teenage years, the world around her would darken. Rome was a cesspool of poison, spies and daggers in the dark. The Borgia name became synonymous with seduction and betrayal, and Lucrezia would become its most enduring and misunderstood symbol. She had no throne, no army, but she had beauty, and that in Renaissance Italy could be just as deadly as any blade. At just 13 years old, Lucitia Burra was dressed in gold-trimmed silk and placed before the altar. The man waiting for her, Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pizarro, 27 and twice her age. The union was arranged not for love but for leverage. The Sforza family was powerful in northern Italy, and Pope Alexander VI wanted alliances as fortresses. Lucrezia, his daughter, was the martyr. The wedding was a spectacle. Fireworks, processions, and Roman nobility pretending not to whisper behind painted fans. But beneath the celebration was tension. Giovanni Sforza was of noble blood, but not powerful enough to be truly useful. And worse, he was starting to seem disposable. Lucia, for her part, tried to play the role. In her teenage years, she was said to be graceful, modest, and deeply pious. She spoke with careful politeness, often quoted the Psalms, and seemed to hold genuine affection for her new husband. But affection didn't matter to the Borgia machine. Within 4 years, Giovanni's value had evaporated. By 1497, the political winds had shifted. The Boer Pope no longer needed the Sforza family, and Giovanni, once celebrated, was now a liability. So the plan was set into motion. Lucrezia was sent to a convent allegedly to rest. Behind the scenes, Alexander VI moved to annul the marriage on the grounds that Giovanni was impotent. Giovanni, humiliated and enraged, struck back with the only weapon he had: scandal. He accused the Pope of trying to dissolve the marriage so he could keep Lucitia for himself. The whispers exploded. Allegations of incest between father and daughter, between Lucrezia and her brother Cesare. Rome's gossip mills burned with stories too salacious to print, but too delicious to ignore. Lucrezia, still barely 17, was at the centre of it all, not as a villain, but as a symbol. Was she the temptress corrupting men from the papal throne downward, or the victim of a system that used her and then blamed her? When the annulment was finalised, Lucitia's reputation had already begun to blacken, not because of what she had done, but because of who she was. The name Borgia came with a scent of poison, lust, and betrayal. And Lucia, she was only just beginning to understand how trapped she really was. Lucitia Burra emerged from her first marriage not as a broken woman, but as a more dangerous one. She had survived political betrayal, public humiliation, and whispers of incest. Yet, as with every chapter in her life, the next would be even darker, more tangled, and harder to explain. Shortly after the annulment of her marriage to Giovanni Sforza, Lucrezia took refuge in a convent once again. Only this time it wasn't just for appearances. It was during this retreat that a mysterious scandal erupted. In 1498, a child was born. A boy listed in Vatican records under circumstances so strange even historians still argue over the truth. The child's name was Giovanni, and 2 contradictory papal bulls appeared. One declared him the son of Cesare Burra, Lucrezia's brutal and ambitious brother. The other, marked Secretissimo, or top secret, claimed that the boy was the son of Pope Alexander himself. Neither document mentioned Lucrezia as the mother, But the timing, her disappearance and the rumours made it clear. Everyone believed the baby was hers. So who was the father? Chisur, the Pope, a secret lover named Pedro Calderon, a Spanish courtier who mysteriously vanished, likely at Cheshire's hands. The truth was tangled in lies and vanished documents, but one thing was certain. Lucitia's body had become the property of scandal itself. She couldn't sneeze without Rome assuming it was a calculated move in a Borgia plot. If the child was hers, she never officially acknowledged him. But she didn't reject him either. Giovanni would be raised within the papal court, first as a bastard, then as a nephew, and eventually as a tool in family alliances. Lucia moved on, as she always did, smiling through the storms and refusing to explain. This era cemented her legend. Lucretia, the beautiful poisoner, Lucretia, the incestuous temptress, Lucretia, the seductive spider at the centre of the papal web. Never mind that there was little proof. Truth had already lost the battle to myth. But far from retreating into shame, she was being prepared for her next mission, a new marriage and a more valuable alliance. And this time the stakes would not only be political, they would be fatal. Lucizia wasn't just a porn star anymore. She was becoming a queen. In a rare twist of fate, Lucizia's second marriage seemed to offer something she had never known before: love. In 1498, at just 18, she wed Alonso of Aragon, Duke of Bischlia, a handsome, soft-spoken 19-year-old from the Neapolitan royal family. Unlike her first husband, Alonso wasn't a political placeholder. He was a prince of royal blood, and more surprisingly, their marriage seemed warm, even affectionate. For a time, Lucizia bloomed. The court buzzed about her beauty: golden hair, pale skin, and eyes that could flicker between innocence and mischief in a breath. She and Alonso were seen walking hand in hand through the Vatican gardens. In 1499, she gave birth to a son named Rodrigo in honour of her father, Pope Alexander VI. It should have been a new beginning, but this was the Bura court. Love didn't last. Power did. Cesare Bouilly, Lucizia's brother, now a warlord obsessed with glory, had just married a French princess and aligned himself with France. Naples, Alonso's homeland, had become politically inconvenient. Cheshire's ambition needed fewer strings, and Alonso was one. The knives began to circle. Alonso, sensing danger, tried to flee Rome but was caught. Then came the attack. One night in July 1500, assassins ambushed him on the Vatican steps. He was stabbed multiple times but miraculously survived. At first, Lucizia, frantic, cared for him personally. She stayed at his bedside, applied bandages with trembling hands, and whispered prayers into the night. For weeks she nursed him back from the edge, her enemies lurking just outside the door. Then, on August 18th, while she was away, a masked man entered Alonso's room. He was strangled in his bed, likely on Chester's orders. Lucretia returned to find him dead, the body already removed. Her grief was real and public. She locked herself in her chamber for days, refusing to eat, speaking to no one. The bright-eyed young bride had become a widow and a warning. The message was clear. In the Bura household, affection was weakness, and survival meant knowing when to close your heart. Lucretia emerged colder, wiser, and much more dangerous. She no longer trusted love. She trusted alliances, and her next marriage would be the grandest and most dangerous of all. In 1501, just months after Alonso's murder, Lucrezia Borgia was once again dressed in regal silk and sent north. This time to marry Alonso d'Este, heir to the powerful Duchy of Ferrara. It was a strategic masterstroke. If the Borgias could tie themselves to one of Italy's most prestigious noble houses, they would no longer be seen as foreign upstarts from Spain. They'd be Italian royalty. But the Este family had their doubts. Alfonso d'Este didn't want to marry a woman whose family name reeked of poison, scandal, and incest. His sister, the brilliant Isabella d'Este, openly called Lucia a harlot. Even Ferrara's ambassadors warned the Duke against accepting this Roman woman. But Pope Alexander VI sweetened the deal with money, land, and military promises, and so, reluctantly, the match was made. Lucrezia arrived in Ferrara in 1502 like a queen from another world. Rome was chaos and corruption. Ferrara was refinement and legacy. Here, the nobility prided themselves on courtly etiquette, education, and dignity. Lucrezia knew she was under a microscope. Every gesture, every word, every outfit was judged. But she didn't falter. She adapted quickly. She wore modest gowns, hosted refined gatherings, and earned praise for her charm and intelligence.